This administration in the United States has completely shifted the dynamic around getting to net zero at all. Comments that Bill Gates made, even in the past week, about effectively a more moderate approach is a complete shift.
Trump surrendering, going back to drill baby drill as he puts it, in doing so he could well be surrendering the greatest economic opportunity in the history of the human race to China.
Let's just come then to the big political development, New York and Zohran Mamdani. Is there a bigger trend here that might lead to something? Hello and welcome to The Forecast. While COP30 gets underway in Brazil, in the US, Donald Trump is ripping up climate policy, blasting his allies for falling for what he calls the world's greatest con job, and big business is working out whether or not to follow his lead. And yet, in New York, Zohran Mamdani, a left-wing populist unafraid to tout a green agenda, has just won the mayoral race. And in the UK, the Green Party has surged under Zack Polanski. So is the direction of travel really a climate rollback? Or is a new left preparing to claim power and reclaim the climate argument? With me from COP in Belém is our Chief Correspondent Alex Thomson. And in London, the financial journalist and author Andrew Ross Sorkin, whose new book, 1929, investigates the Wall Street crash. Thank you both for joining us. Andrew, let's begin with you. I mean, to what extent is Trump trying to cast a shadow over COP30 and frustrate the whole process?
Oh, I don't think he's just trying. I think he is, and doing so quite successfully. All of the rollback efforts that have been made already by this administration in the United States has completely shifted the dynamic around getting to net zero at all. And I think you're seeing it in terms of even the large big tech companies in America that made all sorts of pledges, effectively stepping away from them. The comments that Bill Gates made, even in the past week, about effectively a more moderate approach towards those goals is a complete shift. And despite, frankly, the mayoral elect in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, I am not sure that the direction of travel is in COP's favor, if you will, in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, look, Trump is not sending a high-level team to Brazil. America's coming out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but just focus on that sort of corporate America story, if you like. I mean, you wrote about Bill Gates. I mean, how much of a real rollback is this? Or is there an element to which corporate America is getting on with what it was doing before Trump was re-elected, but just not being as vocal about it as it was before, so as not to annoy him?
Look, I think there's some level of truth to that. I think one of the things that's happened in the United States is the enormous amount of investment being made in artificial intelligence right now, and all of the sort of power and energy ecosystem around that's required has raised real questions about how much carbon ultimately is going to be put out as a function of all of the new technology and investment that needs to be made and energy that needs to get made. So I think in some ways there's been a complete rethink, even within industry, about how to approach these goals. I think there was a lot of good faith efforts that were made during the past administration and before that around net zero. Some companies suggesting they were going to get to even less than net zero, effectively going back in time. But I think actually Bill Gates's comments are especially important in this moment, because one of the things that he's effectively saying now is not that climate isn't important, but especially in a moment where USAID money has effectively disappeared, that now there is a real debate about how resources get spent. And in a world of finite resources, is it going to be spent towards climate? Is it going to be spent towards other things? In this case, I think Bill Gates is now saying, I think we'll probably see him deploy more money towards measles and polio and things like that. And frankly, away at least less than where he was on climate before.
Alex, I mean, to what extent is this shadow being felt in Brazil as COP gets underway?
Well, I think the shadow's clearly being felt in Brazil as it's being felt elsewhere across the whole climate world. But there is, dare I say it, a possibility that we might be getting America here and Trumpism a little bit out of perspective. there is the second industrial revolution on this planet going on. We started, the Brits led it, of course, with coal 150 odd years ago. It's now happening with electricity, and it's now being led very much by China. Now, that's impossible to ignore. And when you set that fact, and it is an economic fact, against what Trump and other politicians of some parties may be saying elsewhere in the world, it comes close to being a little bit irrelevant, you know? I mean, renewables outstripped fossil fuels for the first time last year by 41%. The projection of renewables rollout has exceeded the expectations and the projections of the International Energy Agency by 1,500% since 2015. The amount of money going into renewables is now 2.1 trillion this year. That is twice the amount of money going into coal, oil and gas. More people last year for the first time were employed in renewables around the world energy sector than are employed in fossils. That is the reality. That is what is happening. And nothing that Donald Trump or anybody else politically can say about global warming being a con or net zero being too expensive. They never tell you what not doing net zero costs, by the way. None of that is going to make any difference because big business, frankly, sees the climate breakdown as an opportunity and they're going for it.
And yet, Europe is clearly divided. Its declarations at the beginning of COP have clearly been watered down. Their ambitions have been shrunk. They're delaying the start of the new European carbon market. What do you think is going on there? And what do you think we will then hope to get out of this COP by the end of it?
Well, hope is not exactly thick in the steamy equatorial air here, Krishnan, to put it mildly. And the political reasons for that are obvious. But I mean, the COP is one thing, but it is, apart from anything else, it's fearsomely democratic. So one country out of what is it, 194, whatever, can stymie and sabotage the whole process. The Saudis want to sabotage things because they want to go on exporting oil, the biggest oil exporters on the planet. The Indians have a massive domestic coal interest. They want to keep that going. But at the same time, there is this extraordinary push towards renewables elsewhere. And don't forget, these COPs do matter. If it wasn't for the COP process, we'd all still be talking about the ozone layer. It was a COP which put paid to that and stopped the CFCs going into the atmosphere. If it wasn't for COPs, humanity would be looking at a 4 Celsius rise in temperatures, average global temperatures, by the end of the century. That's been pulled back to 2.6. And in view of what I've just been saying about how the projections for renewables are outstripping, the reality is outstripping the projections for renewables, that 2.6 could come lower still. So they do make progress. It's just, as many people will say, too slow.
Andrew?
Well, look, I think to Alex's point, there's no question renewables are still, on a trend line going in the right direction. But so much of that trend line is actually a function of what's happening in China uniquely. And actually, one of the things that's going to be very interesting to watch over the next several years is how much the United States and frankly Europe want to compete effectively with China when it comes to renewables. That is a functional big question mark right now. But I do think going back to this direction of travel in terms of what corporate America is looking at right now, they're seeing a president that effectively is saying, don't invest in these things. I mean, it's not just saying that that this president is agnostic. This president is not agnostic about where fuel and energy is going to come from in the future. That has become an interesting point, and you have not seen the CEO community rise up and raise their hand and say, you know what, Mr. President, we disagree with you. In fact, they have been silent on this issue in large part, to be honest with you, because either they disagree with the president or frankly, they agree with the president or think that it's a cheaper option to go that approach, even if it's the short-term approach.
Do they not fear, though, that America will just fall behind, that this is a massive missed opportunity as China surges ahead with renewables and takes this sort of global leadership role, that America becomes partly irrelevant, but also way behind in business terms?
Well, look, the big question right this moment is actually a function of tariffs and how the tariff regime is changing everything. I mean, The United States effectively has argued that these tariffs are some kind of national security or resiliency argument. But the truth of the matter is that if you are creating your own domestic economy, the competition becomes less important. Look, I like competition. You like competition. Actually, most CEOs think that they like competition, except when it's competition with themselves.
So the global market in renewable technology is not seen as the big opportunity that it was 2 years ago?
I think that there is a real divide given this idea of the fracturing of globalization right now. I think there's a real question mark within the CEO community, especially in the United States, about what that really means anymore, and what competition around the globe is ultimately going to look like. And the truth is, the United States, while we were creating some of this technology, we were not manufacturing it and exporting it. And so that's an interesting and important factor just to think about in terms of how U.S. business thinks about this. In fact, most of it was being imported.
Alex, I mean, the other thing that may, rear its head in these negotiations is the fear among some countries of Trump using his tariff policy to thwart international agreements. We saw what happened at the IMO over the last few days, where Trump basically blocked an attempt to make shipping more environmentally friendly. Could he do the same at COP30?
He could. Come to that in a minute. Just to come back to what Andrew was saying a moment ago, I'm sure Andrew would agree with me. Don't read too much into the silence of CEOs. CEOs don't pick fights with heads of government. That's not that therefore the board doesn't like it, the markets don't like it, they get on. And in terms domestically of getting on, let's consider, if you will, for a moment, what's happening in the United States. Where's the biggest rollout of renewables in the United States? Which state would you choose? The answer, of course, is Texas. Oil-rich, gas-rich Texas. Their people, they're absolutely forging ahead, and they're forging ahead with as much, perhaps, silence, subtlety, and subterfuge as they can. Globally, it is said in some quarters, and there may be some grain of truth in this, or it may be hyperbole, that Trump surrendering on the issue of going back to drill, baby, drill, as he puts it, in doing so, he could well be surrendering the greatest economic opportunity in the history of the human race to China to get on with it, and perhaps the EU when they get their act together to come on in the coattails. Certainly across the UK, there are many of companies who are forging ahead in the renewables markets and selling right into markets like the United States. We filmed in one last week. Massive batteries, container-sized batteries. Where are they penetrating the market? In the US. Why? Because US companies are being discouraged from doing so, but they need large batteries for when the wind don't blow. Now, as regards the IMO, the big fear, we started this conversation worrying about the shadow of Trump hanging over. It's true Trump isn't sending a high-level delegation. It's true he's trying to pull out of Paris, but that will still take many, many more months to achieve. It's also true that a lot of state interests, California and many states, are sending delegations here to say, look, bluntly, we're not listening to what the White House is saying. We're getting on with making money in renewables. But there is that fear at the end of the International Maritime Organization's conference, where they were trying at last to find a globally agreed way of curbing emissions from bunker oil, from ships' chimneys, if you will, and they were close to it and they had it. Trump sent in his people, the saboteurs in suits, to wreck that. There is a fear that could be attempted here at the COP. But at the moment, Trump is saying that they're not sending any delegation of any real worth, and they're sticking to that. But we shall see.
Andrew, you wanted to come in?
Just one note. During the first Trump administration, the CEO community spoke out quite vocally about things that they disagreed with the president, including on climate, including on his views about the Paris Climate Accord, and so many other issues. And so to suggest that somehow this silence is somehow no different, and that CEOs never speak out against people in power, I think is actually a false choice. I think we saw it in action empirically between 2016 and 2020, repeatedly, over and over and over again. And it's only now, actually, given some of the steps that this administration has taken against businesses, against universities, and against his enemies in other ways, that we have now seen some of the wealthiest people in the United States who would otherwise raise their hand, not raise their hand, out of fear.
Sure, but what we can agree on, Andrew, what we can agree on is that they are, by stealth, getting on with it. They are still doing this stuff.
Some, but I think it's. I mean, I think there is some of it still going on. But I think the path of travel in terms of the ambitions that they had even 2 years ago is just so very different today than it was then.
Can you just
and
explain,
I say it's unfortunate.
Andrew, I mean, what is actually driving Trump? Is it just America first? He thinks, that there is an easier way to prosperity from oil and gas in the short term. Is it some attempts to sort of thwart China by undermining the whole renewable energy, process, or is it that he just doesn't understand this stuff?
I think it's probably all of the above. And some, it's never black and white. I think it's a piece of all of the different components that you just described. I think on the election trail, when he was, making pledges to vast parts of America, especially in towns that had historically coal and other kinds of what might be described as dirty energy and the like. Part of his appeal was he was saying that he was going to help those people get their jobs back. That's what he ran on. He's somebody who historically has not really believed in climate change unto itself. That actually carbon, even in his mind, necessarily is the knob, if you will, that is going to change the dynamic over time. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why, and he would put even climate in this sort of category of wokeism, a phrase that has become the phrase of the day in America, but that has sort of an amorphous meaning in lots of ways.
Let's just come then to the big political development of the day, which is New York and Zohran Mamdani. Is New York just another country, or is there a bigger trend here that might lead to something?
Look, I think there's real questions about capitalism and socialism, and that you're seeing that play out in New York. And I think it's representative of an affordability crisis that's happening in America. I think both parties would agree that there's an affordability crisis in America. The question is, how do you attack that issue of affordability? What I think we don't know, and it'll be a great experiment, is to see what ultimately happens in New York, and how much of his agenda, which includes things that are almost the antithesis for a place that's considered the capital of capitalism, whether that will work. And that's the experiment.
Yeah. I mean, Alex, there are fewer heads of government going to COP than last year, aren't there? But I mean, what is the political feeling, do you think? The sort of, if there is a sort of a center of gravity politically that is moving to the right in lots of parts of the world, is that being felt at COP?
I don't think it is. I mean, the swing of the political center of gravity doesn't quite work like that when you've got this extraordinary sort of, as I said, democracy of 194 countries where everybody has got to agree on anything before anything is agreed at all. You can see from what we've been talking about, what Andrew's just been explaining about the domestic shift in recent elections in the US, quite plainly what people are seeing here and what they're looking to is China as a leader, as giving leadership in this. China has moved. It's moved to address in its NDC, nationally, these national plans that countries are required to come up with. It has for the first time moved to talking in definite, quantifiable terms about carbon reduction. It's doing more by scale, clearly, than any other country on the planet in terms of rolling out renewables. Xi Jinping doesn't come to these things, so there's nothing new there, but they send almost the next best thing in terms of the sort of high command of the administration in Beijing. So they're looking at them to pick up the baton. And here's a slightly weird thing about China. In terms of its NDCs, its plans to cut carbon, its plans to stop or curb its pollution, China's quite unusual. The broad brush is that most countries promise a lot but don't deliver to that extent. China has tended rather to do the opposite, be rather cautious in its approach, in its promises, in what it can deliver, and actually in quite a number of different areas in terms of carbon reduction across the industrial piece, has over-delivered on these plans. So there's a sort of a hunch that might happen here. I mean, the Trump effect obviously has disrupted things, but then again, we've been here before. A few years ago, it was Madrid, a COP conference. Trump first administration pulling out of the Paris Agreement, blah, 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 and high-level delegations. Nancy Pelosi was giving interviews to every local radio station, every local paper on the conference floor to make her point. That won't happen in the same way this time around. But yeah, the shift is to China.
I mean, that's true, isn't it, Andrew? That the pendulum is not going to generally go Trump's way because China and India are not going to agree ultimately because they know it's in their interest to pursue a renewables agenda, not least for domestic economic reasons.
Well, there's no question. And now we get back to the question about tariffs. And, if you live in a tariffed world, what that ultimately looks like, if there is this sort of breakdown in globalization, what does it mean for the United States to even compete with China or for China to compete with the US? And if you're implementing all these tariffs around, it fundamentally changes the dynamics of competition. By the way, back in 1929, 1930, we had tariffs in the United States, and it reduced global trade by 60% within 12 months. And when that happened, I think there was a real wake-up call actually about globalization and about what you would actually want in the context of competition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you took us to your book because I was about to do the same thing. I mean, wait, you're looking at the circumstances that led to the crash of 1929, which is probably not really widely understood by most people. We know there was a crash, but we're not really sure exactly why. To what extent are the current circumstances similar to what was happening back then?
Well, unfortunately, and it was not my intent when I started writing this book. I was trying to bring people inside the room so they could understand what that crisis looked like. The parallels are quite shocking because it was all of the same kind of euphoria that we're living with today, all of this excitement in the marketplace around new technology. Back then, it was telecommunications and radio and automobiles. Today, it's AI and this view that it's going to change the world. And it probably will change the world, but it's bringing in all of this investment that is almost indiscriminate to some degree. And as a result, it also comes with leverage. There were so many loans being brought into play with AI, but back in the 1920s, being brought into play because investors were actually taking out extraordinary loans to bet on all of this stuff in the stock market, both in New York and here in the UK and around the world. And so the real question today, when we're looking at sort of where things are, by the way, this relates actually to some of the renewable efforts as well, as how much leverage, how much debt is there in the system? And the truth is, right this moment, I don't think we know.
So do you think if we got towards another, well, I mean, maybe not a crash, but a mini crash, does that strangle off the climate agenda in developing countries?
Well, look, yes, arguably, there's been an argument for years now that, we've been living in, anytime we have boom times, we're able to afford to do things that hopefully move, the human race forward. Renewables may be one of those things. When you get into a moment of a crash or some kind of austerity, investments in things like that seem to dissipate. The real question, and this has been the big issue at COP for years, is can you make renewables more economically viable than some of these older, carbon fuels that we've been living with for years? And in some cases we have done that. In some cases we haven't. And that's really, I think, going to be a huge dynamic going forward.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, the promise of making renewables more economically viable than fossil fuels has been greater than the delivery, hasn't it, so far?
Well, it depends which dimension you look at. I mean, COP is the last place that you're going to look to affect an economically viable downgrade in the prices that solar panels cost or the blades of wind turbines and so forth. But the market and competition and technology will absolutely do that and absolutely is doing that. You only have to look at, well, anything you want to choose. Let's choose those two examples. The cost of a solar panel, for instance, the cost of a blade on a turbine, wind turbine, for instance. Just go and look at the cost of those, and there's your answer. They're coming down, 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 and dare I say down, as against oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas is a finite, filthy resource. It is running out. certain parts of the British political establishment talk about getting North Sea oil and gas out of the North Sea. Well, a lot of it isn't in the North Sea. It's in the Northwest Atlantic, west of Shetland. It's a long way out there. It's a long way down. There's hardly any oil anyway. So you're looking at gas. So I just throw that out as an example of what is effectively just in simple resource terms, forget economics and politics, simple resource terms, something which is obviously mid-long term a sunset industry. The exact opposite is happening in renewables, and Andrew's right, that is going to be likely impacted in some way should there be, God forbid, some kind of economic crash. However, the good news is, as those prices have come down and that trajectory continues, we would hope there's some insulation to that attack.
And Andrew, just finally, I mean, what would the big risk be that it's the big infrastructure cost that could no longer be financed? It's building these things.
Right. And this is how, but it connects back to energy. So there's a huge infrastructure cost right now, and a lot, hundreds of billions of dollars moving towards building these data centers. It's not just the data centers themselves; it's actually the energy that's going to power these data centers. And so the real question is, when you have, large language model companies and these tech companies that have not become profitable yet, effectively making commitments to buy things that they actually need cash for, whether they're going to be able to make those cash payments in the future. And if we get to a point where they can't make those payments and they've taken on extraordinary debt and there is a crash, that actually will set back not just AI, but will set back, I would argue, the energy complex and some of the renewable efforts as well, given how connected those markets are.
Well, we'll leave it there. Andrew Ross Sorkin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Alex, have fun at COP, and we'll speak again soon. That's the forecast. Bye-bye.